A day after the United Nations tagged Pakistan-based founder of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, Masood Azhar, a global terrorist, the government has called it a win for all Indians. Defence Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and Finance Minister Arun Jaitley held a press conference earlier today. The Defence Minister praised what she called persistent measures by the External Affairs Ministry under the Prime Minister's leadership. Finance Minister Jaitley took a dig at the opposition, claiming that it's not joining the celebration as it fears it will have to pay a political price. China has finally relented and supported India's efforts to tag Masood Azhar as a global terrorist after blocking it for more than a decade. It's worth pointing out that Lashkar founder Hafiz Saeed, the mastermind behind the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, is also blacklisted as a global terrorist by the United Nations. Despite that, he roams freely in Pakistan.
पूरे देश में इसको लेकर सरकार की और माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी की बहुत बड़ी सराहना है, लेकिन दुर्भाग्य इस बात का है जब देश जीतता है तो हर भारतवासी जीतता है। लेकिन विपक्ष के कुछ मित्रों को लगता है कि अगर इस जीत में वो शामिल हो गए तो शायद इसकी राजनीतिक कीमत उनको देनी पड़े।
Well, that's the finance minister there. And even as the government claims victory over Masood Azhar's listing as a global terrorist, former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has attacked the Modi government for politicizing military operations like the surgical strikes. In an interview to the Hindustan Times, the former Prime Minister has criticized the government for allowing investigators from Pakistan into India's Pathankot airbase after a terror strike in 2016. The former Prime Minister went on to term this as the biggest blunder of the Prime Minister. 7 security personnel and a civilian died in the Pathankot Air Force Station after it was attacked by a group of gunmen in a gun battle that ensued for 17 hours. 4 to 5 attackers were also killed. India then allowed a 5-member investigating team from Pakistan to visit the base just 3 months after the attacks to collect the evidence and interview witnesses. Pakistan blamed India for trying to malign its image by staging an attack. In the interview, the former Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Inviting the ISI to investigate the Pathankot airbase terror attack is the biggest strategic blunder committed by the Modi government. The demoralized our armed forces," end of quote. The former Prime Minister also said that India conducted multiple surgical strikes during his tenure as Prime Minister. He said, and I quote again, "Let me remind you that our armed forces were always given a free hand to operationally respond to every threat. Multiple surgical strikes took place during our tenure too," end of quote. Attacking the government for politicizing the forces, the former Prime Minister said, and I quote, "In the past 70 years, a government in power never had to hide behind the valor of our armed forces. Such attempts to politicize our forces are shameful and unacceptable." Well, just hours after the former Prime Minister's interview to the Hindustan Times calling attempts to politicize the forces as shameful, the Congress party has released a list of 6 surgical strikes that took place during the tenure of the UPA. In a press conference, Congress party's Rajiv Shukla listed out 6 surgical strikes carried out under the UPA between 2008 to 2016. That's not all. The Congress has also released details of 2 surgical strikes carried out during former Prime Minister Vajpayee's tenure between January of 2000 and September 2003.
6 हमारी सरकार के, कांग्रेस सरकार के जमाने में मनमोहन, इंदिरा जी का छोड़ दीजिए तो मैं ताजा बता रहा हूँ, मनमोहन सिंह सरकार के जमाने, और 2 वाजपेयी जी सरकार के जमाने में ना वाजपेयी जी ने कभी इनका जिक्र किया और ना कभी मनमोहन सिंह जी ने इनका जिक्र किया, क्योंकि ये सेना का काम है, सेना का हम सम्मान करते, सेना ये काम करती। इन चीजों को कभी जो है पब्लिक नॉलेज में, जनता के बीच में इसकी घोषणा और ये सब नहीं किया जाता, ये परंपराएं हैं।
Well, that's the Congress party on the press conference reacting to the interview done by the former Prime Minister with Hindustan Times. Joining us now to take this discussion forward, Kanwal Sibal, the former Secretary, Suhasini Heather, Diplomatic and Strategic Affairs Editor at The Hindu, Sunetra Chaudhary, National Political Editor at the Hindustan Times. She interviewed the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and also Brahma Chellaney. Gentlemen and ladies, thanks very much for joining us here on the Election Exchange. Ambassador Sibal, if I could start by asking you, it's been long in the making, and finally we've had a breakthrough with Masood Azhar being designated a global terrorist. We can quibble and argue about the references to Pulwama being dropped, but nevertheless, this is a step in the right direction, and it is something that India, as well as the international community, have worked to ensure that this objective has been achieved. What does it now mean for India in the long term?
Well, in the long term, we will get the fruits of this designation only if there is sustained pressure on Pakistan to eliminate jihadi terrorist groups from its soil. We've seen that Hafiz Saeed was declared a terrorist in 2008 by the United Nations. And since then he has roamed free, has been spewing jihadi venom against India. He's been addressing large gatherings there, and he doesn't seem to have been subjected to all the sanctions that are implied when an individual is named as a UN designated terrorist. So the same thing can happen with Masood Azhar, except that at this point in time, Pakistan is much more vulnerable. The only friend it has is China. No other country is supporting it on terrorism because the whole circumstances have changed. US is putting pressure on it. France is very vocal about it. UK too is. And surprisingly, even the Gulf countries condemned the Pulwama attack, and in their joint statements with us, they were very robust language was used on terrorism. Then you had the UN Security Council condemning Pulwama, and that was amazing because it was something that happened in Jammu and Kashmir and against the armed forces.
Right.
And if you look at the kind of position these countries have taken in the past, it was a big departure. Pakistan is also now under great pressure because of its economic situation. The FATF has listed a lot of demands that Pakistan must meet in order not to be blacklisted. So in this situation, Pakistan found that it had no viable option left. And in the case of China, this too was the case. But the concern is that once the heat is off, Pakistan will go back to its old bad ways. And therefore, as I said, there has to be sustained pressure for us to win this war. We have won a battle, a very important battle. It's a step in the right direction, but we have yet to win the war.
Brahma Chellaney, if I could take that point across to you, we've won the battle, we're yet to win the war. What would you now expect in terms of next steps? And as Ambassador Sybil was pointing out, the circumstances are different, and that is why the belief is that this is not just a diplomatic win or a symbolic win, that this could mean much more than just that, because there is the international community, especially the Peace Three, significantly sort of siding with India, standing by India. You did on the 21st of February have the UN unequivocally condemn the Pulwama terror attack as well. And given where Pakistan finds itself in this vulnerable position with its back against the mat, this could in fact be a very different situation for India as well as the international community to continue to put pressure.
The goal was never to get ailing Masood Azhar designated as an international terrorist. The goal is to get Pakistan to root out the terrorist groups that its military has long nurtured. Now, to achieve that goal, as Ambassador Sybil has underscored, we need to exert sustained pressure on Pakistan. Pakistan has never been more vulnerable. It is on the brink of bankruptcy. The coming weeks and months are going to be critical for Pakistan. Now is the time to exert maximum pressure on Pakistan. India has to do its bit. It cannot rely on the international community alone to exert pressure on Pakistan. India has to exert military pressure on Pakistan. India has to take non-military penal actions against Pakistan. And all this hinges on one issue: whether India will get a stable government after the ongoing national elections. Think of a scenario where these elections produce a result in which a stable government is not possible. Then all these diplomatic and other progress that we have made will be in vain. So our own internal political situation post this current elections will determine whether India will be in a position to mount sustained pressure on Pakistan?
Well, that's certainly the narrative that is being driven by the BJP and by the Prime Minister specifically, that a stable government is needed at the centre to be able to put pressure, sustained pressure on Pakistan. I'll come to that in just a bit, but let me go across to Suhasini Heather. Suhasini, we talked a little bit about Pakistan's vulnerability, but if I could ask you about what caused the change as far as China's position is concerned. I was having a conversation just a short while ago with the former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao, and she said that China found itself in an indefensible position, and given the sort of pressure coming in from the Peace Treaty specifically, it decided to move away from that technical hold position. But what do you believe led to the change in stance?
Several reasons, Shireen. Let's remember that China is not actually amenable to the kind of pressure that one thinks one can put just by global isolation. Remember that in the face of all the heat after the Pulwama attacks, on March 13th, China went ahead and placed a hold on Masood Azhar's listing, even though the Jaish-e-Mohammed had claimed responsibility for the attack, and the UNSC had put out that statement. But what happened subsequently seems to indicate to us why China decided to change its mind. To begin with, it is clear that the reset between India and China, Prime Minister Modi's Wuhan summit with President Xi, has built space between the two countries, so that the two countries are able to discuss issues which in the past China saw no need to give way on. Secondly, as you pointed out, the combined pressure that was coming from the US, UK and France, although I would discount, because this kind of pressure has been put in the past as well. And thirdly, I do think that what you're seeing is a signal, perhaps, that Masood Azhar himself is no longer has the kind of value he once had for the Pakistani establishment, because they are realizing the perils of really going ahead with it. And if he has outlived that usefulness, then that is something China and Pakistan were able to agree on. Of course, the official reason that China has given for its change of heart, if you like, is that the wording of the listing no longer includes any reference to India. It no longer includes any reference to Kashmir. It no longer includes any reference to any of the Pulwama attacks, the Uri, Pathankot, the Parliament attack, or anything that happened inside India. Instead, it only sort of designates Masood Azhar for acts he may have carried out in Afghanistan.
Ambassador, if I could get you to comment on what we've just heard there. Sure, what we've heard from Suhasini on what could have made China change its position. Is it a change on account of enlightened self-interest? Masood Azhar no longer of that significance either for the Chinese or for Pakistan itself? And secondly, this opening up of space that Suhasini was talking about, how much would you attribute the change in China's position to that, or to the official position, which is the wording change?
Well, we had the Wuhan meeting, and after the Wuhan meeting, repeatedly, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said there has been no change in China's position. And they maintained it until the last minute. So the first thing to underline, and it is important, that this is by no means a bilateral gesture towards India. Secondly, China is facing huge pressures from the United States on all fronts. So it has to cut its losses in various ways. And in effect, it was challenging the United States, because it's the United States that took the initiative to take the matter to the UN Security Council and expose China. And the United States would have also reaped benefit from it from another angle, which is that they would have shown, exposed the very close China-Pakistan nexus on terrorism. At the same time, they would have strengthened their own relationship with India by taking this step. So China has to deal with multiple pressures from the United States, and maybe they felt that confronting the United States on this issue would only complicate the kind of arrangements that they want to reach with, the compromise they want to reach with the United States on the trade issue. Third, China was getting exposed more and more because its double standards were exposed. It is amazing that they are incarcerating 1 million so-called Uyghur Islamists or people with Islamist tendencies in Xinjiang, and they are supporting a Pakistan-based known Islamic terrorist with a huge history of involvement in terrorism. So China has been blaming the West for double standards in the past, but their own double standards have been glaring. And fourthly, since their position was becoming untenable, they persuaded Pakistan to agree to China lifting the hold, so that it would appear that they have not done it by abandoning Pakistan, but in consultation with Pakistan. And hence all these explanations that Pulwama was not mentioned, India was not mentioned, Masood Azhar may not be useful anymore. This is all a charade. Because if Masood Azhar is not useful anymore, the implication is that the jihadi organizations per se are not useful anymore to the Pakistani military establishment and others. But is it a fact? There is no evidence that this is true. Because if they were serious, they would take some steps against Hafiz Saeed. After all, he's been declared an international terrorist. There's a bounty on his head. They could deal with him. They could try him, begin a trial for the Mumbai attacks, do something to demonstrate that apart from just vague statements that they have no more interest in fostering these terrorist organizations, they should take some concrete steps to demonstrate that. And now, of course, if you look at the explanation they are giving, that, you know, as if they've done a big gesture themselves by agreeing to this, and Pakistan has no terrorist organization. Their General Ghafoor has said that there is no terrorist organization left in Pakistan. Now, if this is the kind of line that Pakistan is taking publicly, then do you really believe that they have no time left for Masood Azhar or Jaish-e-Mohammed?
Well, let's talk about steps that Pakistan is taking to demonstrate that it's serious about this, because we've just been informed that the Pakistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs has announced an asset freeze, an arms embargo and the travel ban on Masood Azhar. But Brahma Chellaney, as Ambassador Sybil was pointing out, I mean, this has been the case as far as Hafiz Saeed is concerned for years now. So do you really take this seriously in any form or fashion?
Well, there are two things here. First, about China. This issue had become an embarrassing issue for China. It had become an albatross around China's neck. And China decided to drop this issue because it was embarrassing China. It was weighing on China's larger interests. On the specific question that you asked about Hafiz Saeed and how Pakistan has been dealing with terrorist entities and individual terrorists. Yeah,
in light of the fact that they've now announced that they are putting that asset freeze and the arms embargo and travel ban on Masood Azhar in that context.
Well, but let's be clear on one fact. The United Nations so far has designated about 270 individuals as terrorists, out of which nearly half are based in Pakistan alone. And out of the 84 terrorist entities that the UN has listed as terrorists, 22 are based in Pakistan. So this clearly shows that Pakistan is the mecca of international terrorism. Now, with so many UN-designated international terrorists and terrorist groups, Pakistan has taken no meaningful action against these individuals or these groups. I think the bigger question to ask is, can we expect a country that has reared terrorists as a foreign policy instrument to act against those very individuals and groups? Is it reasonable to expect that country against the very creatures it has reared and valued, mollycoddled, and aided and abetted? I think it's and that has been established through the course of this panel, that there isn't that much confidence in Pakistan, in fact, taking that forward. But let me switch tracks a bit and get Sunetra in, because it's her interview with the former Prime Minister that's also making headlines today. Sunetra, thanks very much for joining us, and thanks for your patience. Given the comments that have come in through the course of that interview that you've done with the former Prime Minister, it seems to suggest very clearly that the BJP's narrative of national security, of Rashtravad, of using the surgical strikes to win over and woo voters, the Congress
is attempting a catch-up, but perhaps too late?
Well, that's right. It was fascinating. The reason why we brought up, and we weren't really sure that Dr. Singh would open up to such an extent, the reason why this became the main focus of my interview, I was very clear, was let's look at the statements that have emerged from the BJP in the last few campaigns. If you look at the defense minister and the party president Amit Shah's words over there, they've targeted their main issue, of course, and this is, of course, not surprising in the aftermath of Balakot, that it was going to be security. And what we heard was Amit Shah and Nirmala Sitharaman target Manmohan Singh, well, the UPA government, for saying that look at what they did. Two aspects. One, they said after 26/11, the whole narrative of the weak prime minister and the strong prime minister. That, in fact, was that this kind of narrative helped their whole projection of the prime minister as being the strong man, and that whole, the security thing was the main thing. What is surprising, of course, and that's why we brought it up with Dr. Manmohan Singh, what's surprising is the extent and the way and the elaborate way that Dr. Manmohan Singh goes into rebutting that. It wasn't just one aspect. I mean, you mentioned some of the comments over there, how he talked about, how he said that basically how after Pathankot, the way they entered. But what is also significant is that he brought up his key moment, which is the 2000 nuclear deal. Because if you remember, what we remember from the recent political campaign is the Prime Minister saying, the nuclear arsenal that we have, it's not just for Diwali. The Prime Minister then turning it around and saying, well then, in 2008, I risked my government. Who does that for nuclear energy? So that is quite a counter. Not just that, he also talked about the fact, the whole, if you look at the strong leadership image, many of Modi's supporters, of course, equate him with Indira Gandhi and the the role in the Bangladesh liberation. All of that, he said that, look, you can't compare the two. And what's very unusual is Manmohan Singh's strong pitch for showing that he is not what they're saying, that if Modi is a strong man, then he especially deserves that mantle as well. What, of course, is surprising is that, in the interview, he just gives a throwaway line saying that we've done multiple surgical strikes. What's interesting is that the Congress, you may be right by saying that they're playing catch-up, but they actually went into, after Arun Jaitley said that they were invisible surgical strikes, they actually give evidence of it.
That's right. There was a whole press conference that happened today. But Suhasini, if I could get you to comment on that interview that the former Prime Minister has done with Sunetra, and to my point that, look, the sense that I got is, and that press conference was clear evidence that this business of national security, of the Congress being weak, not being able to deal with terrorism, and the BJP, to Brahma Chellaney's point, of being able to provide that stable government, stable, decisive leadership to take on terror groups and take on terror states like Pakistan. The Congress now seems to be trying to recapture some of that space, saying, look, it was not weak leadership, and even when it comes to surgical strikes, we did that. We gave the forces a free hand, but we didn't politicize it in the manner in which the government is doing. But will it cut any ice this late in the game?
Well, Shireen, I'm not really an expert on what might work politically, but this much is true, that governments come and go. Whereas national security, issues of terrorism, issues of diplomacy are actually a running continuity. It is unfortunate, really, regardless of who is bringing it up, if it comes down to a kind of who has more notches in their belt in terms of terrorism, in terms of fighting for national security, because every government has many successes and many failures in this regard. If you look over a period of 30 years that India has been battling this kind of terrorism. So all I can say is I don't think that there is a point or a purpose really in the kind of press conferences we've seen today, which essentially say, try to garner political credit for what is essentially something that India as a nation does.
While, you know, that might be your point of view, Suhasini, but the larger question is it going to have a political impact? Will it result in electoral gains? I won't ask you that question, Mr. Sibal, but, you know, what do you make of the former Prime Minister's comments?
Well, from what I hear, from what has been said by you and others, I'm a bit surprised that at some of the things he has said. Now you look at the United States of America or other Western powers, they have been doing regime changes all over the world. They have been doing it publicly and openly. They've been using the military arms, so I can't understand the point that we did the surgical strikes, but we never made them public. I mean, why not? If you're battling an enemy, if you have political objectives, then reveal what they are. And if other countries use armed forces to achieve their ends, after all, the Chinese have militarized the whole of South China Sea, and they have let it be known that they have done it. They don't hide the facts, so I don't understand this point. Secondly, to my mind, the most important thing about the nuclear, India becoming nuclear, was the fact that we went nuclear. The 1998 tests was actually the most significant decision that we have taken in the area of foreign policy. The nuclear deal was important, no doubt. At that time it was very controversial, and there are certain elements in it which could have been problematic, but since our relations with the United States have developed so well, that those kind of issues that were raised during the nuclear deal and the scope that was given to United States to actually put us in a tight situation, the Americans are not using that because the relationship has moved forward, which is a good thing. And insofar as Uri is concerned, that I'm really surprised, because 8 months after Mumbai, what did that government do? They resumed talks with Pakistan and also separated the dialogue from terrorism. I mean, if you're going to go to that extent to absolve Pakistan of all responsibility for terrorism and say that we are going to have a dialogue with you no matter what you do on the terrorist front, that is far more of a compromise you're making with national security than letting people come to Pathankot
as opposed to inviting the ISI
very close surveillance.
To come to Pathankot.
No, but the whole idea was that they wanted to show that their heart was in the right place, they'll take some action. But they didn't take any action, and after that the whole dialogue collapsed. But to my mind, it was what happened in 2008, and the resumption of the talks and the separation of dialogue and terrorism was far more grave a step in terms of national security than anything else. So
a bigger strategic blunder than the one that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh is talking about. Okay. So, Netra, I'll end by asking you, you know, I just wanted to get a closing comment there from Sunetra. Sunetra, you know, I go back to my conversation with Nirupama Rao, and perhaps the Congress, in a sense, acknowledging through the comments that the former Prime Minister is making, I don't know if you get a sense that they may have misread the political mood and the national temperature, and which is what the BJP continues to play on. There is no conversation about the economy or development or any of that. It continues to be about Rashtravad and national security. Is this an acknowledgement or perhaps even an admission on the part of the Congress party, with then the press conference and so on and so forth, that they may have misread the political temperature and the national mood?
I think you're right, Shireen. I think, and also by speaking, you know, the kind of voices that we're hearing when we go out and speak to people among voters, they do, in various parts of the country, they are talking about security. I think the BJP's messaging has been so strong and it's been so widespread that they have managed to make it the buzzword. And so Congress is realizing, even though till at that time when the assembly elections took place, at that time it was all about, well, the Rafale thing was happening a lot and they were talking about jobs and all, but perhaps that is getting overtaken. And they also point out, and looking at the past precedences, many of of them say, well, it is a fact now, and halfway, this is like much more, more than half. We've just got 3 phases left to go. There is an acknowledgement that, look, perhaps we need to address that as well. So what they've done is, maybe it's late, but what they've done is that the person, if you look at the security thing, how do they counter it? And so this part, going into it, is taking it head on instead of avoiding. Till now, Shireen, it's been that you talk about your issues instead of giving in to their narrative. This perhaps is an attempt at countering the narrative which is being played by the BJP, and it remains to be seen who succeeds in the end.
And is it too little, too late is the question, and what will eventually work with the voters, we will know on the 23rd of May. Ambassador Sibyl Suhasini, Heather, Sunitha Chaudhary and Brahma Chellaney, thanks very much for joining us here on the Election Exchange to talk about the 2 big political developments of the day. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this show. We're back in a moment. Stay right there.